Lieutenant Clinton Johnson knew the sound before he understood the danger. It was a low warning over the radio, a warble in his headset, and then a call that no propeller pilot over North Vietnam ever wanted to hear: enemy jets. He was flying a Douglas A-1 Skyraider, a single-engine attack plane with a huge radial piston motor hammering away in the nose and a propeller clawing at the humid air. Somewhere above and behind him, moving at nearly twice his speed, were MiG-17s, swept-wing jet fighters built in the Soviet mold. In the cold arithmetic of modern air combat, Johnson and the men flying with him were the prey, and the jets were the hunters. It was the morning of June 20, 1965. The Skyraiders belonged to Attack Squadron 25, a unit that called itself Fist of the Fleet. Flying that day from the aircraft carrier Midway, they were not on a bombing run. They were deep over North Vietnam on a rescue mission, sent to help cover the recovery of a downed American airman, and rescue work meant flying low and flying slow, exactly the way a MiG liked to find its victims. The air in the cockpit smelled of hot oil and metal, and the faint, sharp trace of exhaust that always seemed to seep into a Skyraider over enemy ground. Johnson tightened his grip and prepared to do the one thing that might keep him alive. He would turn and fight. What happened in the minutes that followed was not supposed to be possible. A design older than the jets attacking it, a plane that most of the modern Air Force had already dismissed as a relic, was about to meet a supersonic-capable fighter in a turning battle and win. Over the course of this war, the slow-propeller Skyraider would do that not once, but twice. This is the story of how an aircraft built for a war that ended 20 years earlier managed to shoot 2 enemy jets out of the sky, and why that strange fact still matters today. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favor. This channel lives and dies by the strength of its community. If you enjoy carefully researched stories from the Cold War and the conflicts that grew out of it, the best thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who loves history. For a small channel, those numbers genuinely matter, and every single interaction helps these deep-dive documentaries reach new people. That is the whole favor. Now let us go back to that sky over North Vietnam, and to the war that set the stage for it. To understand why 2 old prop planes shooting down a jet was such a shock, you have to understand how badly the air war over North Vietnam was going for the United States in the first year of serious fighting. The sustained American bombing campaign, known as Rolling Thunder, had begun in the spring of 1965. Aircraft carriers of the 7th Fleet stood off the coast in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, launching strike after strike against bridges, rail yards, fuel storage and supply routes. And almost from the beginning, a new and unwelcome problem appeared over the targets. The North Vietnamese had jet fighters, and those fighters were dangerous out of all proportion to their numbers. The most important of them was the MiG-17. It was a Soviet design, a direct evolution of the MiG-15 that had shocked American pilots over Korea a little more than a decade earlier. The 17 was cleaner, faster, and more refined than its ancestor. It could push its top speed to somewhere around 711 miles per hour, brushing right up against the speed of sound. It was small, light, and remarkably agile. And where American fighter doctrine had bet its entire future on raw speed and long-range guided missiles, the MiG-17 was built around an older and simpler idea. It kept its guns. It carried one heavy 37mm cannon and a pair of 23mm cannons grouped under its nose. Those were weapons designed to shred an enemy aircraft in a single firing pass. The pilots who flew these jets belonged to the young North Vietnamese Air Force, and above all to its 1st Fighter Unit, the 921st Fighter Regiment. Later, a 2nd unit, the 923rd Fighter Regiment, would join the fight flying the same type. Their aircraft came from the Soviet Union and from China, which built its own licensed copies of the design. They were never numerous. But they did not need to be. They flew from a small number of airfields that American aircraft were, for long stretches of the war, forbidden to attack. They were guided from the ground by radar controllers, who could position them for an ambush. A flight of MiGs could sit safely on the ground until a formation of heavily loaded American strike aircraft came within reach. then scramble, climb, slash through the formation in a single high-speed pass, and dive away before the escorts could respond. It was hit and run, and it worked. The tactic exploited a genuine weakness in the way the Americans fought. A strike formation heading for a target in the north was often loaded down with bombs, which forced the aircraft to fly slower and turn more sluggishly than they would in a pure fighter role. A MiG did not have to defeat the American aircraft on even terms. It only had to arrive at the right moment, fire, and force the strike planes to jettison their bombs and scatter simply to survive. Even a MiG that scored no kill at all could ruin a carefully planned raid just by showing up. And when the MiGs did press their attacks home, they proved they could bring down the newest American machines. Over the course of the war, the slower MiG-17 was credited with destroying a number of American aircraft, including the big and fast F-105 Thunderchief fighter bombers that formed the backbone of the Air Force strike effort, along with a share of Phantoms. A jet built around an idea the Americans had declared obsolete was killing the aircraft built around the idea that had replaced it. That, more than any single statistic, was what made the MiG-17 so unsettling in 1965. The Americans, for all their technological confidence, were caught badly off balance. The frontline United States fighter of the moment was the F-4 Phantom II, a large and immensely powerful twin-engine jet that, on paper, outclassed the MiG in almost every measure of raw performance. But the Phantom had been designed for a very specific vision of air combat. It was built to fire radar-guided missiles at incoming enemy bombers from many miles away, before the enemy was even visible. It was, in essence, a missile platform. In its earliest versions, it did not carry an internal gun at all, because the planners who shaped it had decided that close-range dogfighting with cannons belonged to the past. That decision would turn out to be a costly mistake. The missiles themselves were the other half of the problem. The early air-to-air missiles of the mid-1960s were temperamental and unreliable in ways that peacetime testing had not fully revealed. Heat-seeking missiles could fail to lock on, could be decoyed by the sun or the ground, or could simply refuse to guide once launched. Radar-guided missiles demanded that the target be held steady within a narrow cone for a period that a maneuvering enemy would never willingly give, and they suffered a high failure rate under real combat conditions. On top of the hardware, the rules of engagement made everything harder. American pilots were frequently required to visually identify an enemy before firing, which threw away the entire advantage of a long-range missile and pulled the fight in close, into exactly the swirling short-range arena where the small and nimble MiG-17 was most at home. Add the restrictions that often kept American aircraft from striking the MiG airfields directly, and the result was a deep and dangerous frustration. So in the spring and summer of 1965, the MiG-17 dominated a piece of sky it had no business dominating. It was slower in a straight line than the newest American jets. It was older in concept and simpler in design, and yet it was knocking down modern aircraft and shaking the confidence of some of the best-trained aviators in the world. Something was badly wrong with the assumptions the United States had carried into this war, and the aircraft that would expose one of those flawed assumptions in the most humiliating way possible was not a secret prototype or a new wonder weapon. It was a design that had been born in the final months of the Second World War and had spent the 20 years since being quietly written off as obsolete. To meet that aircraft properly, we need to step back to a drawing board in Southern California in the middle of the 1940s. The man behind the Skyraider was an engineer named Ed Heinemann, the chief of design at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in El Segundo, California. Late in the Second World War, the United States Navy wanted a new carrier-based attack aircraft, a single-seat machine that could haul a heavy load of bombs and torpedoes and put them precisely on target. Heinemann and his team had been working on an earlier proposal, but the requirements kept shifting and the design kept gaining weight. The story that has followed Heinemann ever since holds that, faced with a demand to fundamentally rework the aircraft, he and a small group of engineers gathered in a hotel room in Washington and redrew the heart of the design in a single intense night, stripping out weight and complexity to produce something far leaner and more capable. Aviation historians have long noted that the tail has grown polished with age, and the exact details are hard to pin down. But whatever the precise truth of that night, the aircraft that emerged was genuinely remarkable. It flew for the first time in March of 1945, initially under the designation XBT-2D1 and the name Dauntless II, a nod to the famous Douglas dive bomber it was meant to succeed. The war in Europe was in its final weeks, and the war in the Pacific would be over by that summer, so the new aircraft arrived too late to fire a shot in the conflict it had been designed to fight. It was, in the most literal sense, a warplane of the Second World War that missed the Second World War. It entered service afterward as the AD Skyraider, and it would be built in a long series of variants, from single-seat attack models to specialized multi-seat versions crammed with electronic gear for early warning and electronic warfare. Douglas would ultimately build more than 3,000 of them. In 1962, when the American military reorganized its aircraft designations into a single common system, the Navy Skyraider was redesignated the A-1, and that is the name it carried over Vietnam. At the heart of the Skyraider sat a Wright R3350, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine, air-cooled and built in 2 rows, capable of producing well over 2,000 horsepower. That engine turned a broad propeller that could claw enormous weight off a pitching carrier deck. The aircraft was not fast. Its top speed sat somewhere around 320 miles per hour, respectable for a piston plane and almost comically slow beside a jet. But speed was never the point of the Skyraider. Everything else was the point. It carried an enormous number of external hardpoints under its wings and fuselage, and it could lift an ordnance load of several tons, a bomb load that stood comparison with the heavy 4-engine bombers of the earlier war. It could stay in the air for hours, loitering over a battlefield far longer than any thirsty jet. It was built like an anvil, able to absorb battle damage that would have knocked a more delicate machine straight out of the sky. And, crucial to the story we are telling, it carried 4 20mm cannons built into its wings. These were serious guns, heavy and hard-hitting, exactly the kind of close-range weapon that the newest American jets had been designed to leave behind. That combination of qualities gave the Skyraider a reputation among the men who flew and fought alongside it that bordered on legendary. A single aircraft could carry a mix of bombs, rockets, napalm, and cannon shells that let one pilot answer almost any call for help and then stay overhead long enough to answer it again. Ground crews told stories of Skyraiders coming home with holes punched clean through the wings and fuselage, with cylinders shot off the engine, and still landing safely on the deck. The airframe was simple enough to keep flying and forgiving enough to bring a wounded pilot home. In a war where the fast jets arrived in a rush and left just as quickly, the Skyraider was the aircraft that stayed, and staying was the whole point. The men who flew it gave it a whole family of affectionate names. Some called it the Able Dog, from the way its old designation sounded when spoken aloud in the phonetic alphabet of the day. Many more called it the Spad, after the sturdy little fighter biplanes of the First World War, a wry joke about how ancient the thing seemed in an age of swept wings and jet exhaust. And later, when it took up one of its most famous duties, the radio call sign attached to that mission would give it yet another name: Sandy. The Skyraider had earned its reputation the hard way, years before Vietnam. In the Korean War, it flew thousands of attack missions, delivering bombs, rockets, and cannon fire against targets across the peninsula, often in close support of hard-pressed ground troops. In one of the most storied episodes of that war, in the spring of 1951, Skyraiders of a Navy squadron carried out a torpedo attack against the Hwacheon Dam, striking the dam's floodgates with aerial torpedoes when bombs had failed to do the job. It was one of the last times American aircraft would ever launch torpedoes in anger, a tactic that already felt like a holdover from an earlier age, delivered by an aircraft that many considered a holdover as well. The Skyraider became known as the plane you wanted overhead when you were in trouble on the ground, because it could stay, it could carry a devastating load, and it was stubbornly hard to shoot down. By the early 1960s, though, fashion had turned hard against it. The future, everyone in the halls of air power agreed, belonged to jets. Faster was better, higher was better. Missiles would replace guns, and the propeller belonged in a museum. The Navy was already planning the aircraft that would eventually replace the Sky Raider in its attack squadrons, a sleek new subsonic jet called the A-7 Corsair II, which would reach the fleet in the years ahead. And yet, in 1965, there the Sky Raider still was, flying from carrier decks in the Gulf of Tonkin, doing the unglamorous and often deadly work that the glamorous jets simply could not. Because the Sky Raider had one gift that no jet in the American inventory could match. It could fly low and slow, for hour after hour, without draining its fuel, and that single quality had pushed it squarely into the mission that would place Clinton Johnson and his fellow pilots directly in the path of a MiG. That mission was combat search and rescue. When an American aircraft was shot down over enemy territory, the pilot who came down under a parachute became the object of a desperate and immediate race. On one side, North Vietnamese soldiers, militia, and ordinary citizens converged on the crash site to capture or kill the downed flyer. On the other, American forces scrambled to reach him first and pull him out. The rescue helicopters that carried out the actual pickup were slow, ungainly, and terribly vulnerable to ground fire, and they could not go in alone. They needed an escort. That escort had to be able to fly slow enough to stay with a helicopter and to orbit a single patch of jungle for a long time. It had to carry enough firepower to suppress anyone approaching the survivor, and it had to be tough enough to absorb ground fire and keep flying. The fast jets, for all their power, were nearly useless for this. They were too fast to circle a single hillside, and they burned through their fuel far too quickly to linger. The Sky Raider was made for the job. Escorting rescues became one of its signature roles, and over the course of the war, the call sign Sandy became a sound of hope for any airman down in hostile country. The on-scene commander of a rescue effort, often a Sky Raider pilot, would answer to a call sign like Sandy 1, coordinating the fighters, the helicopters, and the fire support in a complex and dangerous ballet flown low over enemy guns. These missions produced some of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the entire war. In March of 1966, an Air Force Sky Raider pilot named Bernard Fisher landed his aircraft on a battered, debris-strewn airstrip in the embattled A Shau Valley, under heavy enemy fire, to pick up a fellow pilot who had been shot down and was trapped on the ground. Fisher hauled the man aboard and flew back out through the fire. For that act, he received the Medal of Honor. 2 years later, another Sky Raider pilot, William Jones, pressed home a rescue attempt despite being badly burned and his aircraft badly damaged, refusing to abandon a downed airman. He too received the Medal of Honor. This was the world the Sky Raider inhabited over Southeast Asia, and it was a rescue escort mission on the 20th of June 1965 that sent 4 Sky Raiders of Fist of the Fleet into the path of enemy jets. The flight that morning was led by a more senior pilot, with Clinton Johnson and Lieutenant Junior Grade Charlie Hartman among the 4 aviators flying the mission. They were orbiting deep inside North Vietnam, covering the effort to recover a downed airman. The records that survive do not perfectly agree on every detail of who exactly they were covering that day, a small and honest uncertainty in the historical account, but they agree entirely on what happened when the MiGs arrived. The Sky Raiders were working their patrol when the warning came. MiG-17s were on them. The prop pilots suddenly found themselves in the precise situation every briefing had warned them to avoid at all costs. They were low, they were slow, and there were enemy jets in the sky hunting them. For a moment, the entire logic of the air war seemed about to play out exactly as expected, with the modern fighter cutting the obsolete relic to pieces. And then the physics of the situation took over, and the expected outcome turned upside down. Here is the piece of physics that the jet age had very nearly forgotten. A fast aircraft is not automatically a better dogfighter than a slow one. Speed carries a hidden penalty. The faster an aircraft is flying, the wider the circle it must swing through when it tries to turn hard. A jet racing along near the speed of sound needs a vast arc of sky just to come around and point its nose in a new direction. A Sky Raider lumbering along at a fraction of that speed can pivot inside a tight circle. In a turning fight, the aircraft that can turn more tightly can eventually work its nose around until it is pointing at the other. And the MiG-17, for all its blistering pace, simply could not turn with a Sky Raider down low and slow. If the prop pilots could force the fight into a turning contest, the jet's greatest strength would become a trap. So when the MiGs came slashing in, the Americans did the thing that instinct screamed against. They did not try to run, because running from a jet in a propeller plane is a way to die tired. Instead, they turned hard into the threat, dragging their heavy machines around as tightly as the airframes would bear, deliberately hauling the fight down into the low, slow, twisting arena where the ancient design held every advantage. The MiG pilots, committed to their high-speed passes, came flashing through and discovered that they could not stay with the wheeling, turning targets beneath them. Each time a jet tried to line up its guns, the Sky Raiders would wrench around out of the firing solution, and the jet, unable to turn as tightly, would be carried past by its own tremendous momentum, overshooting the very target it was trying to kill. Johnson and Hartman worked as a pair, and that teamwork was the key. They maneuvered so that a MiG committing to a run on one of them would end up presenting itself squarely to the guns of the other. When the moment finally came, they opened up with those 4 20mm cannons, the same kind of weapon the newest jets had been told they would never need. The heavy shells struck home. By the pilot's own later accounts, the MiG took the fire, faltered, and went down, brought to earth by cannon rounds from 2 propeller planes that the modern age had already consigned to history. It is important to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of story that swells and distorts in the retelling. In that engagement on the 20th of June 1965, the Sky Raiders of Attack Squadron 25 were credited with 1 MiG-17 destroyed. The victory was shared between Johnson and Hartman, the reward for the way they had worked together to lure the jet into a killing position. It was a single kill, not a pair of them in one furious dogfight, and an honest account keeps it exactly that way. The significance was never in the raw number. The significance was that it had happened at all. A piston-engine attack plane, a design that predated the jet it fought, had met a modern fighter in air-to-air combat and shot it down. Word of it swept through the fleet, because it upended something everyone had quietly believed. The 2 men brought their Sky Raiders back to the Midway, having punctured, in the space of a few minutes, the comfortable assumption that a slow aircraft was a helpless one. The full meaning of that morning would take much longer to settle. But before we weigh it, the story needs its second chapter, because the record of the war holds a second time that the old prop plane brought down a jet, and it came more than a year later, in an even fiercer fight. The date was the 9th of October, 1966. This time the aircraft belonged to Attack Squadron 176, a unit nicknamed the Thunderbolts, flying from the carrier Intrepid. Once again, the Sky Raiders were over North Vietnam on a rescue escort mission, orbiting to protect a downed airman and to shepherd in the helicopter sent to save him. Once again, MiG-17s found them, and this time there were several, and once again, the slow planes did the counterintuitive thing. They turned to fight, rather than trying to flee. Among the Thunderbolt pilots that day was Lieutenant Junior Grade William Patton, known to his squadron mates as Tom. The engagement that developed was a swirling, low-altitude brawl, with the Sky Raiders using the same brutal logic their predecessors had used the year before. They stayed low, they turned hard, they refused to give the fast jets a clean shot, and they waited for a MiG to overcommit and slide into a vulnerable position. Patton got his opportunity. Working his heavy aircraft into a firing position on a MiG-17, he brought his 20mm cannons to bear and hammered the jet with fire. The MiG went down. It was the second MiG that a United States Navy Sky Raider would shoot down in the war, and, as it turned out, it was also the last. Between those 2 engagements, the shared kill by Johnson and Hartman in June of 1965 and the kill by Patton in October of 1966, lies the whole truth behind the idea of the old prop plane bringing down 2 jets. Across the entire span of the Vietnam War, the propeller-driven Navy Sky Raider was credited with destroying 2 MiG-17s in air-to-air combat. Not 2 in a single dogfight, but 2 across the long years of the conflict, each one a small miracle of tactics, teamwork and nerve, and each one a reminder that the machine matters far less than the mind and the method of the person flying it. The aircraft everyone had been so eager to retire had beaten the modern jet not once, but twice. Why did it work? The reason is worth sitting with, because it cuts against everything the jet age had come to believe about itself. The MiG-17 was an excellent aircraft, judged on its own terms. It was fast, it climbed well, and its cannons were murderous. But every one of those virtues assumed a particular kind of fight. The MiG was built to make slashing, high-speed attacks, to strike and dive away, to use its velocity as both sword and shield, force it instead into a slow, grinding, turning battle down close to the ground. And each of those strengths curdled into a weakness. Its speed forced it into wide, sweeping arcs it could not tighten. Its energy carried it helplessly past a target that could pivot inside its turn. The very qualities that made the jet lethal in one kind of combat made it clumsy and vulnerable in another. The Sky Raider, meanwhile, was doing the only thing it could do, and that thing happened to be exactly the right thing. It could not outrun the jet and it could not climb away from it, so it turned and turned and turned again, and it stayed stubbornly in the one small patch of sky the jet could not comfortably occupy. Its heavy cannons meant that when a firing solution finally came together, it counted. Its rugged construction meant that the ground fire and the near misses filling that low-altitude arena did not necessarily end the fight. The plane was in its element precisely because its element was the one place the modern fighter least wanted to be. There is a hard lesson buried in all of this, and the United States military would spend the rest of the decade painfully relearning it. The obsession with pure speed and long-range missiles had produced fighters that struggled badly in the close, turning, visually fought battles that the rules of engagement kept dragging them into. The problem went well beyond a couple of embarrassing encounters with an old prop plane. Across the middle years of the war, the exchange rate between American fighters and North Vietnamese MiGs fell to a level that alarmed the leadership of the Navy, a far cry from the lopsided advantage American pilots had enjoyed over Korea. In 1968, the Navy commissioned a searching internal study of the problem, an inquiry that examined why its missiles were failing and why its aircrews were losing fights they should have won. The study's conclusions were blunt. The missiles were unreliable, and the crews had not been trained for the kind of close-range maneuvering combat they were actually facing. Out of that reckoning came a new school, established in 1969, dedicated to teaching naval aviators the lost art of the dogfight. It was the Navy Fighter Weapons School, and the world would come to know it by a single word: Top Gun. The Sky Raider kills did not cause that reckoning by themselves, but they were a vivid early symptom of the same underlying disease. When a propeller plane can outfight a jet, something in your assumptions has gone badly wrong. The men and the machine deserve to be followed past their moment of triumph, because what came afterward says as much about the story as the victories themselves. The Sky Raider went on doing its dangerous, unglamorous work long after those 2 dogfights. Shooting down MiGs was never its purpose, and never anything more than a rare and startling exception, a thing that happened twice in a war of many years. Its real calling remained rescue. As the Sandy escort, the Sky Raider became a kind of guardian angel for downed airmen across Southeast Asia. When a pilot was on the ground and running for his life, it was very often a SPAD that arrived overhead to hold back the closing enemy, to mark the survivor's position, and to guide the rescue helicopter safely in and back out again. The plane that could loiter, that could absorb punishment, and that could place heavy cannon fire exactly where it was needed, saved a great many lives in that role. It paid a heavy price for that work. Sky Raiders flew into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire again and again, low and slow, right where the guns on the ground could reach them. Many were lost, and many good pilots with them. The very qualities that made the aircraft so valuable, its willingness to fly low and to stay long over a dangerous target, also kept it exposed to relentless danger. The men who flew it understood this perfectly well. They flew it anyway, because the mission demanded it, and because there was no jet that could do what the Skyraider did. In time, the Navy did retire the Skyraider from its carrier air wings, replacing it with the jet attack aircraft that had always been intended to succeed it, and by the end of the decade, the propeller plane had left the Navy's front line. But the design refused to simply disappear. The Air Force flew Skyraiders hard in the rescue role and in close support of troops on the ground, and kept them in the fight for years longer. Many airframes were handed over to the South Vietnamese Air Force to fly in their own war. The old warhorse kept working long past the date everyone had assigned for its retirement, in the hands of anyone who needed an aircraft that could stay in the fight after the fast movers had run for home. As for the men of that first famous kill, they carried the quiet distinction of having done something almost no one else ever would. The engagement passed into the official histories and into the proud lore of the squadrons that flew the type. Fist of the Fleet and the Thunderbolts could both say, with complete truth, that their propeller planes had knocked jets out of the North Vietnamese sky. It is the kind of story aviators tell one another for generations, precisely because it was never supposed to be possible. And here is where all of this steps out of the past and plants itself firmly in the present, because the argument at the very center of this story never actually ended. The debate that the Skyraider embodied, the argument between the fast and the slow, between the sophisticated and the rugged, between the aircraft built for one perfect kind of fight and the aircraft built to survive any fight thrown at it, is still very much alive today. When the United States set out, in the years after Vietnam, to build a new aircraft dedicated to supporting troops on the ground and destroying enemy armor, it did not reach for another fast and delicate jet. It built the A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft whose entire design philosophy descends directly from the thinking that produced the Skyraider. The A-10 is slow by the standards of a modern fighter. It is heavily armored around the pilot and the vital systems. It can loiter over a battlefield for a long time, and it is built around a single devastating gun. It is, in spirit and in purpose, the SPAD reborn, a machine designed to be useful and survivable, rather than merely fast. The A-10 has spent much of its own long career fending off people who wanted to retire it, for exactly the same reasons the Skyraider was dismissed a generation earlier. The fast jet establishment has always found the slow, plain, gun-toting attack plane easy to look down on, right up until the moment when troops in a firefight, or an airman down in hostile country, need precisely the qualities that only such an aircraft can provide. The argument repeats itself in every generation of air power. Speed is seductive, but speed is not the same thing as usefulness, and it is certainly not the same thing as survival. Even the name itself has come full circle. In the last few years, the United States has fielded a new special operations aircraft built on the rugged airframe of a propeller-driven crop duster, a modern machine designed for exactly the kind of low, slow, persistent work that the original SPAD once carried out. The Air Force chose to call it the WWII Skyraider II, reaching back across more than half a century to the plane that first proved slow and simple could still matter in a world in love with fast and complex. That choice of name was no accident. It was an acknowledgement that the old lesson still holds. That lesson is the real reason this story endures. In the middle of the 1960s, the most advanced air arm in the world had convinced itself that the future had only one shape, that it was fast, high, and armed with guided missiles, and that the slow, gun-armed propeller plane belonged safely in the past. Then two of those propeller planes met modern jets in the sky over North Vietnam and shot them down, and the tidy story the jet age had been telling about itself cracked wide open. The machine that was supposed to be helpless turned out to be dangerous in the hands of pilots who understood exactly what it could still do. Clinton Johnson and Charlie Hartman did not have a secret weapon on that June morning. Neither did Tom Patton in the autumn that followed. What they had was an old airplane, a set of heavy cannons, a clear head, and a firm grasp of a piece of physics their own Air Force had half forgotten. They turned to fight when every instinct screamed to run, and they forced the battle into the one narrow slice of sky where their ancient machine held the upper hand. In doing so, they proved, in a handful of violent minutes spread across 2 years of a long war, that the newest and the fastest is not always the answer. Sometimes the answer is the aircraft everyone else was ready to throw away, flown by someone who understood, better than the experts did, exactly what it was still good for.